Good evening. My name is Chris Ham, and today I'd like to share with you the topic of athletes, their finances, why the majority of them end up going broke, and how I plan to fix it. Before we begin, I would like to let y'all know that this is going to be my dream job, being a financial consultant for athletes. So why is this going to be my dream job? For 3 reasons. I've combined 3 passions into one to create this great dream job. I've always had a knack for helping people out. I've always been really intrigued by the business side of things. And I've also been an avid sports fan all my life. Before we get into our discussion, I would like to outline some of the target points of our discussion so you can get a better picture, you can get a more clear understanding of where we're going. First, I'm going to start off by describing the financial aspect of sports and a little bit of history about that. Secondly, I will be moving into the typical athlete, what common traits we see out of these athletes, and how they happen. Thirdly, I will move into the status quo, which is what is happening today that's causing all these financial blunders. And finally, I'll conclude with what I'm going to do to change it. So, when looking at the financial history of sports, it's important to look at 2 main aspects: financial valuation and player salaries, both of which have been growing exponentially since about the 1970s. And this is all due to TV revenues being a catalyst for both the franchises and the players. They've been moving together at an exponential rate. One good example to show the increase in valuation would be my beloved Dallas Cowboys. Let's not talk about their win-loss record this year. Let's just talk about their valuation. Jerry Jones bought the Cowboys in 1989 for $150 million. Today, they're worth over $2.1 billion. Many say Jerry's a great businessman. I wish I could say the same about his football practices. Moving on to salaries, they've also, like I said, increased at an exponential rate. One example would be the major leagues. In 1967, the average major league salary was $19,000. To be fair, let's adjust that for inflation, which is roughly around $100,000 in 2012. But that's nowhere near the $3.2 million the average major league salary is today. Just looking at these average salaries doesn't tell the whole story, though. We also have players like A-Rod with a $250 million contract. New Orleans Saints quarterback Drew Brees just signed a $100 million extension. And my personal favorite, which I find the most outstanding, is LeBron James, a $90 million guaranteed contract from Nike as an 18-year-old before he ever stepped foot on the field. So these must be blessings to these players and their families. And it's very easy to say they are, but at the same time, they're a curse. This is epitome of a double-edged sword. So why is it a double-edged sword? Well, let's take a look at the typical athlete to lend some light on this. I believe the main problem with the typical athlete is their socioeconomic background, namely their lack of financial education. One example that I'm sure will stick with you even after I'm done here today would be the story of Rickey Henderson, the Major League all-time base stealer. The Oakland A's signed him for a pretty hefty contract, and they gave Rickey $1 million signing bonus. About a month later, the A's front office called Rickey and they said, "Hey Rickey, we've seen the check hasn't cleared. Is everything okay?" And he goes, "Yeah, everything's fine. I framed it." I know it's hard to believe, but there are a myriad of stories about financial blunders from these players. For example, not being able to know how to cash a check or going to a check cashing service to cash their first NFL paycheck. One former NFL quarterback, Sean Salisbury, really put it into perspective for me when he was describing his first NFL paycheck, saying, I made more in 1 week than what my dad made in 3 years. And I just found that really shocking. It's easy to get bogged down with a $100 million contract, but that really puts it into perspective. So now I feel like we've set the framework, we've understand a little bit more about the athletes, and we have a good picture of the environment that they're operating in. So now let's look at the status quo, what's happening. And there are a few main topics here that I'd like to cover. Number one would be their lack of internal controls. Within accounting, we always talk about this lack of internal controls in my accounting classes, and we also talk about it in business today. Look at Sarbanes-Oxley. Well, for these athletes, they don't even know what that means. But what is happening is they're having their wingman be their accountant, their financial advisor, and their agent at the same time. It's just a recipe for disaster. Continuing with the financials, these players also get into many very risky investments. They always want to be on top of the game. They have this innate feeling of competition. They always want to make the best investments. They always want to dress nice. And this also transfers over into gambling. Michael Jordan had an interview. Michael Jordan's father was in an interview once, and they were asking about Michael's gambling problem. And he goes, "My son doesn't have an addiction to gambling. He has an addiction to competition." Some other greats that have lost to gambling too would be John Daly, over $50 million, and Charles Barkley admitted he lost over $10 million. And he'll be the first one to tell you that that's just terrible. So with these investments, their competitive spirit, and gambling, there's one more thing to put the icing on the cake. The big D, divorce. During my undergrad career, my favorite accounting professor always told us this: pick your life partner wisely. It'll be the most important financial decision you ever make. And they can be costly. Which is the same for athletes as well. Over 60% of athletes get divorced within 3 years of exiting their professional careers. And we hear all the time about how expensive these divorce cases are. Greg Norman, $105 million. Tiger Woods, $100 million. And looking at current events today, you might be familiar with Chris Humphries, NBA star, getting into a little tanglement with Kim Kardashian. And if I was his financial advisor, I would have looked at the historical trends and told him to never touch those assets. So now we have a complete picture of what's really going on in this very unique situation of finances for athletes. So how am I going to change it? Well, first, I feel like acquiring knowledge for myself will be the most important. I'm started off with an accounting and economics background to get some good technical skills and a different train of thought. I've decided to pursue my MBA at Ole Miss to become a more well-rounded businessman, and upon graduation, I plan to sit for the CPA exam. Eventually, after a few years, I will earn my Certified Financial Planner certification, and combined with the hands-on experience I'll earn in the working field, I feel like I'll be adequately prepared to really help these athletes. One other way I'm going to make a difference is by reinforcing a 3-step system, which is accumulation, which these athletes have no problem accumulating the wealth. Preservation, actually holding on to the wealth. This is the hardest part. And perpetuation. Usually we think of perpetuation as lasting longer than your lifetime. But here, it's just to last the 60 extra years that you'll have once you're out of the game. Far too often, these athletes go into a financial consult, maybe in a big skyscraper in New York City, and they're under a lot of pressure and a lot of technical lingo is thrown around. They're getting preached at. Well, I'm not going to be the preacher. I want to be the teacher and have an open conversation with them and really build that relationship, because relationships are really everything. After we have a good foundation with the athlete, I will put them in a technical financial boot camp. because it's important to show them the numbers and how their actions are not only going to affect them, but their families, and their families for hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years. Here we'll really focus in on the perpetuation aspect. I think it's really special to have your grandkids go to college. So as the sports industry continues to grow, which I have no doubt that it will, it's going to present numerous opportunities for upcoming athletes, their families, and the whole sports industry, myself included. I look forward to working with these athletes and making a real difference and saving them a lot of trouble along the way. Thank you, and have a great day.